Hello, my name is Visala, and today or this evening we have Professor Christian Miller from the US as a guest.
Great to be with you today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and thank you for hosting me.
Good of you to come. So our discussion today will be mostly focused on the issue of virtues, and I would also like a little bit to talk about vices, not just virtues. But we might begin the discussion by just examining the issue of virtue, the concept of virtue. So how would you define virtue? What is a virtue and how it's connected to morality?
Sure. So I'm thinking of virtues mainly in a tradition that comes from Aristotle. So I'm going to, it's not an original approach of mine. It's one that has a long history of thinking about virtue, going all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. I'm also going to be focusing on moral virtues. So virtues come in different kinds. There's civic virtues, there's intellectual virtues, we can talk about aesthetic virtues, prudential virtues, religious virtues. But to keep it more focused, let's look at moral virtues in particular. So examples would be things like honesty, compassion, justice, courage, temperance, fortitude, gratitude, graciousness, and the like of that. Those are particular virtues. What is a virtue, a moral virtue in general? I'm thinking of moral virtues as character traits. So they're part of our character. They're part of our in particular, our moral psychology of how we think about the world. So moral virtues are not just a matter of acting well. In fact, I think primarily what they have to do is controlling and influencing how we think about the world. And they have, I think, three main parts to them. There's the cognitive side to them, which is beliefs, what beliefs you have about, say, right and wrong and good and bad. There's the emotion and feeling side to them, including how you're motivated to act. And this cognitive side and this more emotional side together can give rise to outward behavior. So to make it a little bit less abstract, let's take a particular virtue. Take compassion, for example. So a compassionate person has a particular character, a compassionate character. It's a character trait, it's part of their psychology, that leads them to think certain ways. So they think about why it's important to help this person, why I shouldn't ignore this person's needs. They're also motivated in a certain way. They're motivated selflessly or altruistically to alleviate the suffering of others for its own sake, regardless of whether they benefit or not. So it's not about them, it's about the other. That thinking and that feeling can then produce compassionate actions. Like they see someone who's drowning in a pond, they hurry in and help that person not drown. They see someone who's in desperate need of food or water, and they provide money or actual food and water to help that person in their difficult situation. So to sum it up, I think virtues are character traits that have three main dimensions to them, and it better be that these are intrinsically good character traits. So they're going to be thinking well, feeling well, and then acting well. That's going to be a virtuous person.
So you can't really know whether a person is virtuous by just looking at a single instance of a moral behavior. Let's say someone behaves morally once and you observe that. You can't really say much about whether the person is virtuous because you can't infer the emotional or the cognitive bit from this single action.
That's right. And I also can't infer the consistency either. Yeah. So there are many reasons why I cannot conclude that's a virtuous person. As you said, let's take a specific action. The person donates $1,000 to charity. And we see that happen one time. Well, is that a compassionate person? I don't know. First, I need to know something about where the person's heart is, what's underlying that behavior, why they do it. If it was just to get a tax deduction, or if it was just to create a good impression on others, or to impress a particular other, like a significant other, to say, oh, wow, look at I'm so great, that's not virtuous motivation. So that won't count for that reason. However, there's also another reason why it might not count. It could be that all that other stuff is admirable. The heart is in the right place, but it was just a one-off. And otherwise, the person rarely donates, rarely does anything to help others. This was quite remarkable, exceptional, that this particular event happened. So it helps to illustrate more of the contours of virtue. Virtue had better be stable over time, leading to patterns of, say, compassion action across days, weeks, months, and years. And it also better be consistent or stable across situations. So not only maybe making donation to charity, but in all other contexts where, in our example, suffering is involved, a virtuous person is going to step up to the plate, at least to some extent. So, yep, I agree with you.
So you used the term moral character, and what if I say something like this? So we've looked at the moral psychology of human beings, and it seems that the behavior of individuals or actions of individuals tend to, more than we actually think, they tend to be dependent on the actual situation in which they find themselves in. Instead of exhibiting a kind of pattern or behavior over time and across different situations, it seems that our actions are quite situation dependent. So this seems to undermine the idea of there being such a thing as moral character. And if moral character is something that is necessary for having a virtue, then this seems to produce a problem for virtue.
Right. And what you're alluding to here is a very famous discussion in philosophy. It actually goes back even prior to philosophy and psychology. This so-called situationist debate was happening, especially in the 1960s and the 70s, and then it kind of fizzled out and other views came along. But it was picked up in philosophy, in academic philosophy, at the turn of the century by a couple of philosophers, in particular Gilbert Harman at Princeton and John Doris, who's currently at Cornell, who advanced this line of skepticism about the extent to which character actually exists. Or if it does exist, and they would say it does, but at least not the kind of character we're talking about here when it comes to moral virtue, and vice as well. So what do I want to say about that? A couple of things. First of all, the fact that our behavior is dependent upon situations is a trivial platitude. Of course our behavior is dependent upon situations. Right now, I'm behaving in a certain way because I'm in a situation of being interviewed by you. That's different than I would behave if I was in other situations. Of course, if I'm in a situation where there's a drowning child, I'm going to behave differently than if I'm in a situation where there's no drowning child. So it's universally agreed that behavior is dependent upon the features of the situation we take ourselves to be in. What's more controversial and interesting here is what features our behavior tends to be sensitive to. If you're a virtuous person, you're going to be sensitive to the right features, the virtuous aspects of your situation, the suffering of the child, the fact that a promise was made, the fact that this would be an act of cheating. You're going to be paying attention to those features and responding appropriately to them. Does that, in fact, happen in the real world? Well, now the psychology comes along and shows us, I think, pretty clearly that sometimes that might happen, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes our behavior is remarkably sensitive to features of the situation which are morally either problematic or irrelevant. And so I'll give examples in a second. But because of that, that gives us good reason to think that most people fall short of the standards of moral virtue. So moral virtue might be rare. It's also going to have the same implications for moral vice. People's behavior does not seem to be sensitive to the kinds of considerations that a vicious person would be sensitive to. So there's good reason to think there's lack of moral virtue, widespread lack, and also good reason to think there's lack of moral vice, widespread lack there too. Now let me take this 2 steps further. First, what are some examples of these morally irrelevant factors, just to illustrate the idea here? And then secondly, why I think there doesn't undermine character in general. Even if this is true, virtue is rare and vice is rare, it doesn't undermine character in general. So some examples. Let's see, here's one I like to use about helping. So in a study by the psychologist Barron in the 1990s, he was looking at what influenced helping in a shopping mall in the US. And he had a control group. By the way, all these shoppers had no idea they were part of a study. They were just secretly observed. The control group were people who were passing by clothing stores, and then individually they were approached and asked if they could help out with making a change for $1, so just help out with a simple monetary task. And most of them did not do it. It was, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but about 15%, 20% helped. So what? Well, the interesting thing was, what about shoppers, and these are different shoppers, who had just passed Mrs. Fields cookies or Cinnabons, which, I don't know, maybe to your listeners might not be as familiar, but those are places where, very nice aromas were coming through the air, and it smelled really good. And so these shoppers had just passed those stores, one of those stores, and then were approached to do the same helping task. 60% plus helped in that kind of situation. So about 20% in the first group, about 60% in the second group. What's the main difference? Well, it's not the helping task. It's not the mall. It's the same mall. It's the presence or absence of the smell. So what difference does that make? Well, we could tell a story whereby the smell put people in a good mood, and if they're in a good mood, they're more likely to want to maintain their good mood, and here comes a chance to maintain a good mood by helping someone else, so that increased motivation to help. But the main thing to take away from the story is, look, helping was influenced by a morally irrelevant factor. It shouldn't matter to a virtuous person whether they had passed Mrs. Fields' cookies or not. If the right thing to do is to help, they should help in the clothing store situation, or they should help in the Mrs. Fields situation. Similarly, if people are callous, that's the vice, that's the opposite of compassion, they're indifferent or cold-hearted, it should also not matter whether they pass the clothing store or Mrs. Fields' cookies. They shouldn't help in either case. So we get the same pattern of parallel non-helping as you would parallel helping in the compassionate person. But lo and behold, it did matter. So evidence for lack of virtue and lack of vice. Doesn't prove anything, it's not conclusive, it's just one study. You never want to jump from one study to big claims about possession of virtues or vices, but we start then aggregating. We get more and more studies like this, varying the situational features. They could be whether strangers helped or didn't help. It could be whether the room was clean or messy. It could be whether there was loud noise outside or not. We start getting more and more of these environmental features into the picture, and we start seeing more and more of this patterns of behavior which don't live up to the expectations for either virtue or vice. Now, final point, which is, well, then what lessons should we learn about character from this? Well, character is the broader concept here. Virtues are a type of character, vices are a type of character, but virtues and vices aren't the only types of character. I want to say that this kind of research gives us good reason to think, yeah, virtue's rare, vice is rare, but character is still widespread. It's what I call a mixed character, where it's a kind of character which will lead people to behave in stable patterns over time and reliable patterns across situations. They're just not reliable patterns that you would measure against virtue or against vice. So let's actually use the very example we had with the shopping mall. From this kind of study, we can reliably, I think, predict that people who pass these good-smelling stores will help more than people who don't. That's a small thing we've learned about character. That will generalize beyond just this one shopping mall and this one Mrs. Fields cookie store. That can lead us to make predictions in the future stably over time. And it can also lead to some predictions across situations, because there's no reason to think that it's specific to Mrs. Fields cookies. It's a matter of that putting people in a good mood. And it's the good mood that's really doing the work here. And so if people are put in a good mood, they're probably going to help more than they would otherwise in a variety of different situations. Shopping malls or not, making change for $1 or not, you're going to get an element of cross-situational consistency, stability over time. So you're going to get those features of character traits. These are impacting our thinking, impacting our motivation, impacting our behavior in these ways. It's just that it's not going to live up to the standards of virtue nor the standards of vice, but it's still a character. It's still real. It does work. It's causal. It's explanatory. It's predictive. But it means that most of us are a mixed bag.
Yeah, because the skeptical argument coming from the situationist literature is not just the fact that you are being influenced by the environment. That's, as you said, everyone really understands that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's an issue of control. That when we assess one another morally, so if I want to assess your behavior and try to blame you for something or praise you for something, that doesn't seem to be an appropriate attitude towards you if the actions don't really originate in you. So the problem is that if it's really the case that situations are so influential in people's behavior that they kind of bypass what people's values and character are, then you get a skeptical problem. So it's not really the fact that you're being influenced, but you're being influenced in a way that you can't control or you don't really understand. And your behavior doesn't reflect your values and your views or your character. That's, I think, the core worry, the skeptical worry.
I would say that there are multiple worries. That it depends on what you're interested in and what implications you want to draw. So when this was originally raised in the psychology literature, the worry was just about whether personality exists at all. And whether as personality psychologists we're doing not we, but people back then, were doing anything that was valuable. Or we're just operating under an illusion that there is this thing called personality that takes the form of individual differences and it can explain and predict people's behavior. So that was what they were worried about, whether that's real or not. In the philosophy literature, early on there was a worry primarily about it that had to do with ethics. And in particular, people like Harman and Dorris were trying to cause worries for approaches in ethics that were centered around virtue, like Aristotelian virtue ethics and other, but not just limited to Aristotelian virtue ethics. And we can talk about that if you like, trying to give us reason to reject whole systems of thinking in ethics, which would be quite a significant result. Now, you're pointing to yet another source of potential worry, which is a major one too, and that emerged over time in the literature. There's more and more writing about this, especially in the last 10 years, about whether this research leads to skeptical conclusions about moral responsibility and praise and blame and so forth. So, and that's quite, I think, worth worrying about too. I think you've already gestured at some of the ways you might push back against those skeptical worries. If it were the case that situations just force people to behave a certain way or control people, bypassing human agency and internal psychological states and so forth, more in a kind of behaviorist manner, then yeah, I would be very worried about what happens as a result. Good thing that's not the case though. And it hasn't been thought to be the case for decades in psychology. It's an interactionist approach is what's going on here. So there's interaction between what I bring to the situation and what the impact the situation has on me. So I don't get controlled by the situation. Why not? Well, because there are individual differences. So you put people in these situations and they don't all behave uniformly, which is what you would expect, and I guess maybe it's more really simplistic, but if you put all these people in the same situation and situations control behavior, you'd expect everyone to behave the same way. They don't. There are individual differences tied to individual, explained by individual differences in psychology, underlying psychology. And so what's instead going on is that, yes, the situation has an impact, but we also bring things to the situation. We construe the situation in a certain way. We interpret it. We have our values. We care about certain features as opposed to others. We're motivated in certain ways. I'm going to respond to certain features in ways that differ from how you're going to respond to certain features in the same situation. And so because of that, situations lead to behavior partially as mediated by individual psychology. And that gives us a locus to look for responsibility. Now, how much responsibility? Well, that's probably going to take us into different theories of responsibility, and then we get into the mess of, just like every area of philosophy, there's no consensus, and there are different views are out there which have prominent defenders but have strengths and weaknesses. So on one prominent theory, in order to be responsible, you have to be reasons responsive, so you have to be able to be sensitive to certain kinds of moral reasons and have at least a capacity to be sensitive to them. And so on that view, would you still be able to be morally responsible if the kind of picture emerging from psychology is true? I say yes. We'd have to go through the details, because even that view has different iterations and forms. There's strong reasons responsiveness, moderate reasons responsiveness, weak reasons we're not going to get bogged down in the weeds here, and that's the kind of work that people, like you and do, who know a heck of a lot more about responsibility than I do, to check to see, given this theory, would we meet the requirements of that theory for moral responsibility? And I'll say, according to at least the main plausible theories I know that are out there, we still pass the bar.
So staying and still talking about the issue of control. So virtue, as far as I understand it in the Aristotelian way of thinking, is something that you acquire. The same thing as vice. So it's not that you're not born with a virtue. So a virtue is something that you have to somehow acquire. So how does then one acquire or cultivate virtues?
Yeah. So there's one little wrinkle to what you said, which is, if we really want to take Aristotle seriously, Aristotle had this idea of natural virtue, and so he thought that maybe there was you kind of are born with, or early on get certain people have advantages here, and that is borne out to some extent in the genetic literature. I think there's some evidence. I'm not an expert. I'm a philosopher after all. That at least certain parts of our personality are genetically influenced, and so some people, for example, might be genetically more empathetic than others. So we're not all starting with a blank slate, nor are we starting at an equal playing field here. Having said all that, Aristotle wanted to turn our attention to what we could do once we had sufficient agency and freedom and voluntary control over our behavior. And that's what I'll focus on as well, once we got to a certain age and develop those capacities. And I do think, first of all, that we can move the needle on our own character. You can't just assume that. You need actual empirical support for that, but there's good evidence from psychology that character and personality more generally are malleable, at least, and changeable, at least slowly and gradually. You can't flip a switch and make yourself more extroverted, for example, overnight. And then, well, how can we go about promoting virtue and working against vice, if that's what we want to do? Of course, you have to make a case that that's something important and that's worthwhile, but supposing we make that case, well, there's no one pill we can swallow, no easy solution here, nor is there one golden strategy to follow either. There are a variety of different strategies that have been distinguished and articulated and critiqued over the years. Maybe I'll just mention three quickly, if that's okay, acknowledging that there are others, and the ones I'll mention, I'm going to be moving quickly through them. So one very prominent strategy is to look to role models of virtue. So I think most people are not virtuous, and the evidence backs that up empirically, but I say most people. It's a bell curve, and there are outliers. There are, of course, some vicious people too, but there are exemplars in every culture. Depends on what virtue we're talking about. Honesty, we might look to Abraham Lincoln. Courage, we might look to Harriet Tubman. Compassion, we might look to Jesus. Lots of different examples we could point to. But the idea is they've got there in a way that we haven't, or at least that I haven't. They are further along the spectrum from vice to virtue than I am. And so I can learn more about them, not just for the sake of intellectual knowledge, but learn more about them in such a way that I admire them and am moved emotionally, I'm inspired by them to become more like them. It matters whether the exemplar is attainable or not. As you can imagine, if it's so otherworldly, that can be actually discouraging. If it's a relatable exemplar, someone I can connect to, as opposed to someone thousands of years ago, Socrates, can I really relate to Socrates? And it matters if there's an emotional connection to the exemplar. So often local people in our lives are more impactful exemplars than famous celebrities or distant historical exemplars. Okay, that's one strategy. Another one is having more reminders in our lives. So the thought being that with some exceptions, most of us do know the right thing to do most of the time. Now, there are some people who don't know the right thing or don't care about doing the right thing, but most of us not only know what the right thing to do is and care about doing the right thing. However, we often have competing values like self-interest alongside knowing the right thing. And what more reminders can do is help get us back on track by keeping our priorities straight and where they need to be. So to make that a little bit more concrete, in the educational context of my university, we have an honor code, sometimes called an ethics code in other countries, or code of ethics, where before any test, the students have to sign their name, pledge their honor that they're not going to lie, cheat. Well, you wouldn't steal, but you probably wouldn't lie either, but at least cheat on the test. And so that they're going to uphold the standards and values of the university in the next however long the test is. That's been shown to be quite effective in curbing cheating behavior. And what it does is it serves as a moral reminder. It makes salient to the students what they already believe but might not be thinking of at the moment, namely that cheating is wrong and it's important not to be a cheater, brings that fresh and calls it to mind. So generalized beyond that, that particular example, can we have more reminders in our lives to keep our priorities where they need to be? Both individually, what more reminders can I have, whether that's a reading that I start my day with, whether it's a diary, whether it's text messages, whether it's conversations that I have with other people, or it can also be institutionally in our environments, bringing in the situation again. So signage on the walls in schools, messaging that's coming from my company. Again, the honor code and codes of ethics like that can be more external, environmental forms of moral reminders that can keep our perspective where it needs to be. And then the last one is what I call getting the word out, but it's really just increased self-awareness. So it has to do with examining ourselves in such a way as to be mindful of the obstacles in our own lives that are holding us back from virtue. That our minds are not always transparent to us. Sometimes we deceive ourselves. Sometimes we don't want to confront the truth about ourselves. Sometimes we just don't know that there are some obstacles in our minds that are holding us back from being a virtuous person. And we can learn more about those obstacles through self-examination and self-awareness, but also through benefiting from existing research that's being done that's over the years disclosed more and more about human psychology that we didn't know about. More and more about the impact of authority figures and how we're often inclined to obey authority figures, sometimes in very dangerous ways. The Milgram research from the 1960s was very illuminating there. Research about how impactful fear of embarrassment can be. That when we're in group contexts and emergencies happening and no one else is doing anything, we're often likely to hold back ourselves. Why? Well, now we know it's in part because we're afraid of embarrassing ourselves in front of others. And as research has, the group effect, the bystander effect is now well established. So with the help of this existing research, we can learn more about getting the word out, about this research, learn more about our psychologies in such a way as we can not just, for the sake of intellectual knowledge, but can counteract some of these negative tendencies. So when we're in an emergency and we find ourselves holding back in a group context, don't give in to that tendency. When someone is telling us to do something and we think this is questionable, have the courage to not conform. Those kind of ideas have to do with greater self-awareness. And it's the third strategy. So sum it up, role models, increased moral reminders, and greater self-awareness are three approaches that I find have some intuitive appeal to them and some experimental support but none of them have been thoroughly, I would say, experimentally tested in a way I would like to see them tested. So.
I wonder what you think about the idea of self-control and how it relates to virtues. There's a lot of interesting work that is being now done and has been done in the last 10 years or so on self-control. And the way that I tend to think about it is that self-control consists of various kinds of skills that you use in different situations to implement your intentions. And this problem that we human beings have, and especially given this new knowledge that we now have on the situational dependency of our actions and our behaviors, it seems that there's really no one single skill that you have for self-control. It's not like you have willpower in a tank and then it applies to every situation. No, it takes a different kind of skill to resist an authority figure than it takes to resist buying potato chips or something like that. So it consists of certain kinds of practical skills in various kinds of situations, and you can be quite skilled in some area but not necessarily in others. But it seems to me that the same kind of skill of self-control, is it needed just to acquire virtues or to cultivate them? Is it a virtue itself? In an Aristotelian perspective, it might even be a virtue in itself, that you are able to, that you're not incontinent,
Right.
So I was wondering about what you think of this connection of virtue and self-control.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you, which I try to be, which we're talking about character here. I have not worked on this particular character trait very much. It's one of the ones there's so many and I haven't gotten to it yet, basically is the answer. I could say some initial preliminary things, but it's sketchy. You might think of it as, so first of all, is it thought to be important for the acquisition of virtue? Yes. For the development and cultivation of virtue? Absolutely. For the maintenance of virtue? Even if you do get to become a virtuous person, you don't get to like pack it in and go home because there's a danger of backsliding and ceasing to be virtuous. So it's important even for the maintenance of virtue if you get there. Is it something that can be manifest in some areas of life and not others? Absolutely. This goes along with the mixed idea. It doesn't have to be the case that if you're a virtuous person for any virtue, virtue comes in degrees. It doesn't have to be the case that you're automatically going to be exceptional in every area with respect to that virtue. So you can be self-controlled in some areas more so than others, and maybe you haven't even gotten far enough to qualify as self-controlled at all in some areas of your life while doing well in others. So it seems right. What it might be true, though, is that it could be a second-order virtue or an executive virtue. So it could be a virtue that is concerned with the regulation of more primary virtues. So, and again, this is more speculative, and I defer to people who have worked on this a lot more. But it could be that, take honesty, it could be a self-control is very helpful in succeeding in being honest in given moments and carrying forward with your plan to be an honest person, or your goal, your aspiration to be an honest person. Same thing with temperance with respect to food. A self-controlled person could come up with particular practical strategies to implement to try and avoid gluttony. So punctuality. In order to cultivate this virtue, you might do something like this. Set an alarm to go off 30 minutes before an appointment to make sure that you arrive at the appointment on time. Even though it's way earlier than you need to, knowing yourself, you're going to have this implementation intention to carry out this plan to counteract your negative tendencies. And that would be a form of self-control. Putting the alarm across the room. Knowing what you do about yourself and how hard it is for you to get out of bed, you have to crawl out of your bed and go across the room to turn it off to make sure you're punctual in that way. So I tend to think of it initially, again, as more of a second order or executive virtue that could be helpful in means and implementation of primary virtues. But that's sketchy.
So moving on to the issue of religion and virtues. So religious traditions, I think all the big religious traditions place a lot of emphasis on moral development, be there whatever kind of religion. But it seems that it's crucial for religions to help their participants to be better people. So what kind of methods or religious ways of cultivating virtue are there, and do we have any evidence that they actually work?
Right. So we can carry out this discussion in one of two ways. We could talk about religion in a kind of general, amorphous way, or we could focus in on particular religions. My choice has been to focus on particular religions because, one, I have no idea how to define religion. It's actually quite a vexing problem in philosophy of religion to come up with a tight definition that's going to include and exclude the right views. So I'm not going to worry about that. It could be that atheism is religion. It could be that agnosticism is religion. So we'd have to go very carefully there. And also, I worry that if we talk about religion in general, just focusing on, say, dominant world religions, we're going to paint with too broad of a stroke to, make points about Islam and Hinduism and Confucianism, as if they're really, saying a lot of the same things when it comes to virtue. I'm sure there's some overlap, but I'm sure there's some difference too. So all by long preface by way of saying my preference here is to go deeper into one religion. And so the one I focus on mainly is Christianity, just because, well, I'm coming from a culture that's primarily Christian. I'm a Christian myself. That's the one I know the best by far. And I think a lot of the points that could be made about Christianity could also generalize fairly smoothly to other religions too. So, having said that, I never want to argue that Christianity has a monopoly on this. It's never going to be the case that you'll find me saying that you have to be a Christian in order to be virtuous, or no atheist can ever be virtuous, or anything like that. So, we want to clear out those misunderstandings from the start. So, diving into a particular religion like Christianity, the question was, well, what particular approaches might they have to fostering virtue, and is there any evidence that those approaches are effective? And I think that the answer to both questions is yes. Are there particular practices? Yes. So in the case of Christianity, I think that it's a multifaceted, complex religion, but there are a number of things that most believers do as part of an authentic Christian life which have character-building implications. Even if that's not what they're thinking about in the moment, as either maybe they're the goal, but maybe there's a byproduct of practices that they're engaged in. So prayer can have character-building implications. For example, it can foster humility. Even if that's not what you're praying for, the mere fact that you are putting yourself under a higher being and asking for a higher being to do something and acknowledging you can't accomplish it yourself, you need the help of a higher being, that can have, as a byproduct perhaps, implications like growing humility in one's character. Tithing and generosity, confession and courage and humility. We can go down the line of different practices that most Christians participate in, having, I think, clear connections to particular virtues that can be fostered, again, by authentic practitioners who are devoted to that religion. And these points, they carry over to other religions. So nothing I've said so far is specific to Christianity, but I'll again focus on Christianity. This is all happening in a social context, so it's not individual Christian on his or her own, although that could be the case. It tends not to be, though. It tends to be prayer with others around, asking for prayer for yourself, or praying together in a small group, or asking a priest or minister to pray for one. It tends to be that generosity is exhibited through donations or tithing in a communal context with an offering plate, or when others are around as well. So you get social support mechanisms in place which strengthen virtue by providing outlets of support, encouragement, role models, discipline, all these other good things which are only going to help the practices foster virtue. And then from a Christian perspective, there's also this idea of God helping too. It's not just humans on their own, which if it was humans on their own, it could be, you could have some cynicism about that. Whether you're religious or not, you just might think human beings mess things up all the time. They're not that great at fixing themselves or fixing things in the world. But there's this idea in Christianity that God is helping to reaching down to our level. And it's a longer story, which we don't have to get into here, about how that might manifest in sanctification and the work of the Holy Spirit, etc. Okay, the other part of this was, is there any evidence? And I'll say yes, but tentatively and with some hesitation. What evidence could you look for? Well, we're talking about virtue here, so you're looking for evidence of improved character. What are we contrasting this with? Well, you're looking for evidence that Christians over time are getting better, and maybe you're looking for evidence that in comparison to a secular control group, for example, if these practices are actually adding something, they're enriching the character of Christians, you would expect to find a difference, a tangible difference between a group of Christians and a secular control group. What do we find? Well, we find a limited kind of evidence, which are correlational studies between measures of religiosity and good outcomes. And the measures of religiosity might be everything from frequency of attending services, frequency of prayer, frequency of reading the Bible, reported degree of belief or commitment to Christianity. These kind of things are on the one hand. And then outcomes like better education, better performance in school, not dropping out, so educational outcomes, health outcomes, including depression, mental health, lifespan, frequency of getting mammograms. I mean, it's quite diverse array of outcomes. In the health realm, subjective well-being, so how happy do people report themselves being? Charity work, so frequency of volunteering, amount of money donated, criminal behavior, so you can imagine different things there. And what's the overall trend? Well, there's no 100% trend here. It's always messy. But the dominant trend is as measures of religiosity, or as religiosity increases on the different measures, the outcomes are better. So, for example, on measures of religiosity, that when that goes up, volunteering goes significantly up. Amount of money donated to charity, both religious charity and secular charities, goes up. Okay, so I didn't do this research, I just read it in the journals. Let's take it for what it's worth, on face value. Why then am I cautious? I'm cautious because, one thing, it's just correlational. So it doesn't show that the religious practices cause the good outcomes, although I think the causation is going to go in both directions, and it would be shocking if it didn't. So I speculate that there's causation here, but we don't know. And then the other reason I'm hesitant is that it doesn't automatically tell us about virtue. As we discussed at the very beginning, virtue is more than just behavior. It also has to do with underlying psychology, and none of these studies measure motivation, for example. So we don't know if the motivation behind the increased helping or the increased charity or the increased donations is virtuous motivation or crudely self-interested. I speculate it's sometimes one, sometimes the other. I don't think religious people are always, or Christians are always crudely self-interested, but I don't think they're always altruistically motivated either. So I speculate here, but I can't empirically establish anything definitive.
So imagine a critic listening to all that and saying, okay, very well, there's a connection between certain benefits of religious behaviors, and also we have perhaps some evidence that religion also, and Christian religion in particular, cultivates some virtues. But there's also some evidence in psychology that Christian religion and religion in general cultivates vices too. So might that not balance the scales? So there's some evidence to say, for instance, that one of the things that religious behavior and practice do is that they reinforce the in-group, out-group difference. So yes, there's more helping, but you're helping your in-group more than the out-group, and then this in-group, out-group distinction might be enhanced by religious behavior, and as a side effect, it might produce all sorts of not so moral attitudes like prejudice or racism and various other attitudes. So it might kind of balance out. You know, you have some benefits, you have some virtue cultivation, but you also have some vices.
Yeah. So great points. A couple of things come to mind initially. So in this discussion, we're talking about kind of comparative effectiveness. So we're looking at, say, Christian practices as compared to some other group. And so if we're talking about, say, secular practices compared to Christian practices, which ones are more effective? One strategy which has, I think, has limited significance, but it's worth pointing out, is the same line can be run with respect to secular practices too. So when we look at the impact of, say, secular worldviews and secular ideologies on moral behavior, well, there's some good benefits, of course, but there's also a terrible track record in the 20th century of dominant worldviews causing or factoring into the causing of terrible atrocities, say, in the Soviet Union or the Holocaust and whatnot. So no view here is immune to bad effects. We're looking at comparative goodness and badness here. Now, a nice rejoinder to that is to say, well, of course, if we're just opening the Pandora's box to any view out there, there are going to be some secular views that are going to have terrible consequences, of course. We're not talking about that. Let's exclude those from the discussion. We're going to talk about the best forms of the secular views and say, well, can't they get you everything that you want compared to Christian practices when it comes to virtue cultivation? And I say, yeah, that's how we should have the discussion. And then let's do the exact same thing about the best forms of the Christian views. So, of course, there have been forms of Christianity actually implemented historically that have led to atrocities, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and so forth. But on the parallel reasoning, we should exclude them too. And this is going to carry over to now the second part of your question, which was, what about things like in-group and out-group consequences? Well, any version of Christianity that's going to have direct consequences for, say, fostering racism, well, that's no good, of course. And they just need to be excluded as unreasonable or unacceptable versions for this discussion. What about unintentional? So is it going to be the case that even on the best forms of Christianity, they can't help it? It's going to be unintentionally going to lead to some differences here. I guess I have two points to offer. One is that some in-group, out-group differences, I think, are fine. Mere differences in behavior or consequences which track in-groups versus out-groups, that is not necessarily a bad thing. So in this kind of context, if it turns out that Christians donate more to Christian charities than they do to secular charities, I don't see that from a Christian perspective as necessarily a bad thing. If they're advancing causes that Christians think are especially worthwhile, the fact that they're giving more of their money to one as opposed to the other, I don't see that as automatically negative. And especially if it's the case that the amount that they give to secular charities is greater than the amount that secular individuals give to secular charities. Then you're still giving more to the outgroup than the competing philosophy is. So that's one point. And then the other point is, then it just becomes an empirical question of whether the best forms of Christianity are inevitably going to have negative outgroup consequences. Or is that more a contingent fact about particular individuals and time periods? So to take one example of that, there's interesting research linking Christianity to racism. So correlational research again, so we don't know the causation, but on measures of things like religious fundamentalism or extrinsic religiosity, as those go up, measures of racism tell us that racism goes up. But in a meta-analysis of this research, it turned out that that effect was especially pronounced, and these were all studies done in, or I don't know, but all, primarily studies in the meta-analysis. There were 55 studies, primarily in the U.S. communities. The effect was especially pronounced in the 1960s and 70s, maybe not so surprising, but has diminished over time. So it's gotten weaker and weaker and weaker up closer we get to the present, which suggests that it's not inevitable that there would be this relationship between the two. It can fluctuate and change depending upon other factors like political circumstances, cultural circumstances, and maybe the extent to which these Christians are taking seriously the very teachings of Christianity itself to love your neighbor as yourself. So those are some thoughts.
Thanks. So to illustrate some of these issues that we talked about virtues, it might be useful to focus a little bit on one specific virtue. And you've recently run a big project, or still running a big project, on honesty, the virtue of honesty, and you have a book out on that. And the subtitle of the book says that honesty is a neglected virtue. So why do you think it's a neglected virtue, and what explains that?
So the book is called Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. And it's multiply neglected, so it's ambiguous there. It turned out by the end of the book, it's neglected in the sense that most people don't have the virtue. So it's been neglected in our society and our own characters because it's absent in that sense. But that was not really what I had in mind. The primary sense of neglect was just at the academic level. In philosophy, there were 2 articles that I was aware of in a philosophy publication in 50 years on the virtue of honesty. And that's stunning. I mean, rarely happens in philosophy that we miss something so big to that extent. And same thing is for edited volumes and monographs, just kind of barren wasteland of research on this really important virtue. So what explains that, I haven't come up with a good answer to that. I have some guesses. One part of it is that, in general, virtue was neglected in academic philosophy for a number of years, and only kind of more recently has caught on again. For much of the 20th century, virtue ethics and discussions of virtue were not to be found, or not very prominent at least. And then by the 1970s, and especially the 80s, that turned thanks to the work of prominent people like Alistair McIntyre, Martha Nussbaum, Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, and others. It was only then that virtue ethics and virtue in general was kind of getting fashionable again. And then it took a while after that for particular virtues to get on the scene. There's a kind of stage of how this went, process of a series of stages how this went. And honesty was not one of the particular virtues that got back into the discussion right away. Others like modesty, you might be surprised, listeners might be surprised to hear this. Modesty got a lot of attention as one of the first virtues to get examined in the philosophy literature. Why modesty? Well, what happened was that, and maybe this is overly simplistic, but a philosopher wrote an article on modesty and put forward a very controversial and probably implausible, I think it's probably implausible, view about that. And yet it was so interesting, and partially because it was implausible, maybe people got worked up about it and said, no, this can't be right. Here's my view, here's my view, here's my view. No, your view is no good. Now we start putting forward views, and we start multiplying the literature and getting some momentum behind this otherwise, you would think perhaps not a big deal virtue. Well, it didn't happen for honesty. No one made the first step of putting forward a view which, even if it wasn't, the true view, at least would get people worked up to come up with a true view. And so I'm trying to make that step now. It's later, though. It's much later than the modesty article was 1989, I believe. The virtue revolution happened in the 70s and 80s, and now my book came out 2020, I should know it's 2021. So it's much later than these others, but I'm trying to do that. Get this out there, get people talking about it. And if my view falls into the flames, oh well. I'm not, unlike some philosophers, I'm not like personally invested. It's not going to lead me into professional depression or anything like that. But if it generates new work, so much the better.
So what is the virtue of honesty then?
Yeah. So it's a virtue, so it's going to have those features we already talked about. It's cognitive component, motivational component, behavioral component, cross situation, stable over time. To unpack, let's unpack a couple of those. Behaviorally, it's wide-ranging. I think it's broad in scope. It covers lying. Of course, it doesn't support lying, but it pertains to lying. Cheating, stealing, misleading, BSing, self-deception, hypocrisy. It covers lots of moral territory. Also, another reason why it's surprising it hasn't gotten more attention, because look how much ground it covers. But at its core, despite that diversity, it has to do with, in my view, not intentionally distorting the facts as the person sees them. So not on purpose misrepresenting the world as you see it. So to take an example, if you asked me what university I teach at, and I said to you, in fully understanding your question, and I said to you in a very serious manner, I teach at University of Helsinki, I would be intentionally, on purpose, misrepresenting the facts as I see them, because of, clearly I don't teach at University of Helsinki. It's obvious to me I don't. But in my verbal report to you, I'm saying that, and I'm failing to be honest in the process. So if I instead said, I teach at Wake Forest University, that's how I see the world, that would be an honest answer. It does not intentionally mislead or doesn't intentionally misrepresent or distort the facts as I see them. Now, this is an interesting thing about honesty, which is that honesty does not track the truth. It tracks, at least it does not track the objective truth. It tracks the subjective truth. So suppose, unbeknownst to me, that I got fired yesterday, and I haven't been informed yet, but the administration back at Wake Forest fired me yesterday, and you ask me today, where do I teach? And I say Wake Forest, I'm giving you an honest answer, even though it turns out to be false, because I've been fired. I don't know that, but that doesn't matter for my honesty. So that's some on the behavioral side. On the motivational side, I think it's not enough just to say tell the truth and not cheat and so forth. It depends on why you do that. Again, motivation matters. And here I have a view which is, well, the behavioral view is controversial too, but the motivational one is especially controversial. I say self-interested motivation is not going to cut it. So you don't get whatever self-interested motivation. It could be, I don't want to get fired. It could be, I want to get rewards in the afterlife. It could be, I want to make a good impression on someone else. That's why I'm telling you the truth. Nope. Other than that, by and large, most motivation is going to be fine. And it can come in different varieties. It could be loving motivation. Why am I telling you the truth? Because I care about you. Friendship motivation. Why am I telling you the truth? Because you're my friend. Justice motivation. Why am I not cheating? Because it would be unfair. Dutiful motivation. Why am I not cheating? Because it would be the wrong thing to do. The moral law says it's forbidden. Even explicitly honest motivation, like, why are you not cheating? Because it would be dishonest to cheat. All these are different answers I could give. If they are reporting my actual motivation, I would say that's virtuous. Those are distinct, but all acceptable virtuous motivations. And so I say pluralism reigns here, so long as we don't go into self-interest. That's my view about motivation, and then I also give you my view about behavior. And I'll stop there. I could go on and on, but I don't want to give too long an answer. So
what would be the corresponding vice or the vices to honesty? So dishonesty or something like that?
Yep. There are two ways to go here. We can go at the level of honesty and think about corresponding vices, or we could break it down into the different domains that honesty pertains to. I'll do that for briefly, but I'll go back mainly to the honesty at the macro level. So we said that honesty pertains to lots of different domains. So say lying, being a liar, that's one way to fail. That's being honest. Being a cheater is another way to fail. Being a habitual promise breaker, being a thief, being a BSer, being a hypocrite. All these are ways of, in that particular domain, failing to be honest, and are sufficient to make you dishonest in that respect. Now, to address it, I think, more directly, the virtue is honesty, the vice is dishonesty, but that's the vice of deficiency. I'll come back to this question of whether there's a vice of excess as well. So the vice of deficiency is dishonesty. In order to be a dishonest, then you have to be dishonest in all those different areas. You don't get to count as dishonest, period, if you're just a liar. You've got to be dishonest in those different areas, and then cumulatively that makes you a dishonest person. Now, Aristotle had this view about vice where it's not the case that there's just one vice. He maybe thought that there were many, but at least two. There's a vice of deficiency. Say in the case of courage, the vice would be cowardice. There's also a vice of excess. In the case of courage, it would be rashness. I don't know if I accept Aristotle's view for all virtues. I think it works fine for something like courage. I don't know if it works for patience, and I don't know if it works for honesty either. So it's easy to say, oh yeah, of course it works for honesty because we have this thing called being excessively honest or too honest. And we criticize people for oversharing and being excessively honest. So here's an example that I use in the book. You're riding in the elevator and you're going up to your office, and here comes on the elevator someone who you barely know, and they ask you how you're doing. And you proceed to give a very long answer. You talk about your kidney stones, and you talk about you going to the bathroom, and you talk about what you had for dinner, and you talk about how much money is in your bank account, and you're like rattling all this information off. Well, something's gone wrong here. It's completely inappropriate. You could say that it's a failure of honesty. You're oversharing. You're being excessively honest. I don't initially go that route. I say, well, actually, if everything you say is accurate to your self-understanding, it's how you see the world, you're actually not failing at honesty at all. As far as your honesty is concerned, you're fine. You're failing with respect to some other virtue. Maybe discretion or tact, or maybe partially self-control as well. But there's a flaw in your character elsewhere. And so I'm initially inclined to say there's only the vice of deficiency. There is no vice of excess for honesty.
So here's my last question. It pertains to honesty, but virtue in general. Mm-hmm. So here I am living my normal life. Why should I care? So why should I care whether I'm virtuous or not? So why should I care whether I'm accumulating vices or whether I'm cultivating virtue? Mm-hmm. So what's my motivation for engaging in this kind of project? Because of course it takes a lot of effort. It's to cultivate virtue, and it's quite difficult, and there's no guarantee that I will succeed. Why bother?
Yeah. Probably should have asked that early on.
Yeah, but we can edit the whole thing, and we can put it in between.
I'm just joking.
Yeah.
No, I mean, so why bother listening to this podcast too about virtue? So it's a great question, and I completely agree with the caveats or the qualifications you gave there. It is difficult. It takes a lot of effort. There's no guarantee you're going to succeed. So we need some kind of inspiration here, motivation to embark on this path. Maybe more so than we already do. To some extent, maybe in our ordinary lives, we already are doing this, but to do it more. I think there are multiple reasons that could motivate someone. So there's no one answer to this. One way a person could be motivated to become more virtuous is emotional. So the tendency is to immediately, as a philosophers, go into arguments and try to present really compelling arguments to rationally convince someone to do this. It turns out that doesn't often have much of an impact on actually moving people's lives in a different way. And what can be much more impactful is our emotional considerations. So presenting people with the stories of virtuous people and trying to foster emotional connections to those stories can sometimes inspire a lot more change than 10 really powerful philosophical arguments. So, encountering the biography of Lincoln, or watching a documentary about Paul Farmer and his work for Partners in Health in Haiti, or seeing a movie about Harriet Tubman's courageous actions in helping slaves be liberated and make it up to the North. That's one way to be moved, to change your own life in this direction. But since we're philosophers, we should do the other stuff too. So there are a variety of different arguments you could give. Some are religiously based, so depends on who the audience is here. If the audience is someone who's already religious, there are all kinds of resources you could appeal to within that person's religion. And I can say that pretty confidently. Every religion I'm familiar with cares about virtue and has all kinds of resources within that religion to emphasize the importance of virtue. Okay, leave that aside too. Let's suppose it's someone who's not religious. Well, there's the point that virtue is just intrinsically good. That it's a good in and of itself, independent of the benefits. Now, to what extent will that move people? Hard to say. But it's just noteworthy that it is one of the most important good things intrinsically in life. So two more things. One is impact on society, and then final one is self-interest. So a reason to care about promoting virtue, not just in your own life, but in society at large, is that it makes society better off. It makes society better off for you living in a society, but also just makes society better off, period. And if you care about your society, which most of us do, we often care about our groups in a larger context than just me, and we want our society to flourish and be better off, well, virtue is going to help a lot with that. To make that more concrete, compare a society that's mired in corruption and cheating versus a society that's honest. One is going to be a lot healthier and flourish as a society than the other one. The final point, though, to make is maybe the most motivating argument, at least, is going to be the one that appeals to self-interest. Because after all, self-interest is an important motivating consideration for most of us. And if we're also to believe the story I gave you a while ago about how most of us are not virtuous, well, virtuous considerations are probably not going to move us, but self-interest still can. And so what's the idea there? Well, there's lots of evidence linking increased virtue to benefits for ourselves. Not always, but as a general statistical matter, as individual virtues and virtue in general goes up, you see effects like increased academic achievements, greater life satisfaction, greater health, lower depression, things that we care about as people, that we want to have in our lives, we value and we're trying to acquire, perhaps could be acquired by becoming a better person. Now, if that's right, I want to make sure I flag that, though, with a final caveat, and I'll stop, which is this makes it primarily egoistic. It's, okay, I'm going to pursue virtue for the sake of benefiting myself in certain ways. And that's a good starting point. It can set us on this path, but at some point, the motivation has to change. Because virtue, at the end of the day, can't be primarily egoistic. So it will be a self-defeating process if it only stays at the level of egoism. It has to move beyond that. The hope is that at some point you'll see, okay, it's good to be honest to my friends for its own sake. regardless of whether I benefit or not, that's just a good thing to do. It's good to respect for them and care for them, independent of whether I benefit. And the more we move and see those things, the less we're egoistically motivated, and the better chance we have to actually become more deeply virtuous and grow further and further in virtue. So it can't end with self-interest, although it can start with self-interest. You know, I'll stop there. Yeah.
I think that's a good point too, good place to stop.
Well, thanks for great questions, and thanks for your time and interest in our conversation. So.
You're welcome. Thank you.